In 2017, a company nobody had ever heard of started quietly buying farmland in a rural corner of Northern California. No press release, no announcement, just deed after deed, quietly filed at the county office, month after month, year after year. By the time anyone figured out what was actually happening, this mystery company had already spent close to $1 billion and become the single largest landowner in the entire county. One quick honest note before we dive in. This isn't 10 separate billionaires secretly buying up 10 random towns. It's one massive, connected land deal, backed by some of the biggest names in Silicon Valley, quietly reshaping an entire region, one small town at a time. Local farmers got calls offering far more than their land was worth. No explanation given, just cash and silence. Some said yes. Others got sued when they refused. Today, we're breaking down 10 small towns and communities caught right in the middle of this exact story, building up to the place standing to lose or gain, the most out of all of them. Number 10, Elmira, Solano County. Elmira sits quietly near Vacaville, the kind of small, easily overlooked community most people driving through Solano County wouldn't even notice on a map. That's exactly why it became part of this broader story almost without anyone realizing it. Land purchases connected to this mysterious buying spree extended into the surrounding countryside here too, absorbed into a much larger pattern most residents didn't fully understand until years after it had already started. For a small agricultural community like Elmira, this kind of quiet, persistent land acquisition raises questions that don't have easy answers yet. What happens to the farmland surrounding a small town once outside buyers start purchasing at a scale locals have never seen before? Longtime residents here have watched neighboring plots change hands without much explanation. Deals closing quietly, sellers walking away with unusually generous payouts while remaining tight-lipped about exactly who they'd sold to or why. This pattern of silence became one of the defining features of this entire story. Buyers who wouldn't explain themselves, sellers who'd signed agreements not to discuss the details, leaving everyone else in these small communities to piece together what was actually happening from scattered rumors and secondhand information. Elmira represents exactly the kind of quiet, easily overlooked community that ended up swept into something much bigger than anyone there originally signed up for. Farmland changing hands as part of a plan residents wouldn't fully understand until national headlines eventually explained what had been happening in their own backyard the whole time. Number 9, Jepson Prairie area, Solano County. The Jepson Prairie area holds genuine ecological significance, home to a nature preserve protecting rare vernal pool habitats and wildlife found almost nowhere else in the entire state. That made it particularly notable when land surrounding this sensitive ecological area also became part of the broader purchasing pattern sweeping through Solano County during this exact same period. Conservationists who'd spent years working to protect this specific ecosystem suddenly found themselves facing questions about what large-scale development might mean for the fragile habitat sitting right at the center of everything they'd worked so hard to preserve. This wasn't just about farmland changing hands anymore. It introduced a genuine environmental dimension to the whole story, raising concerns about water usage, habitat disruption, and long-term ecological impact that go well beyond simple questions of property ownership and land value. Local environmental groups have specifically flagged the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta region, which this preserve sits within, as an already stressed ecosystem, one that's central to California's entire water supply system, and therefore especially vulnerable to any large-scale development nearby. What makes Jepson Prairie particularly significant within this broader story is exactly this tension. Private land purchases butting up directly against protected, ecologically sensitive terrain that many residents and conservationists believe deserves far more caution than a rapid, secretive buying spree typically allows for. For anyone who cares about preserving genuine ecological diversity throughout California, this specific piece of the story adds a layer of concern that goes well beyond simple questions of who owns which farm parcel and why. Number 8, Montezuma Hills, Solano County. Montezuma Hills isn't really a town in the traditional sense. It's a distinct rural region best known for its rolling hills covered in wind turbines, generating clean energy for the surrounding area for decades already. This exact region became ground zero for one of the stranger legal twists in this entire story. A lawsuit alleging that local landowners had actually colluded together, price-fixing and deliberately overcharging the mysterious buyer attempting to purchase their land at scale. Think about that for a second. Instead of simply refusing to sell, some landowners here allegedly worked together specifically to extract inflated prices from a buyer who clearly had deep pockets and seemed determined to acquire land regardless of cost. This represents a genuinely unusual dynamic compared to most land disputes. Typically, you hear about buyers pressuring reluctant sellers. But here, the accusation actually flips that script entirely. Sellers allegedly banding together to squeeze as much money as possible out of a buyer they knew was desperate to keep expanding their land holdings. The wind farms themselves add another interesting wrinkle too. This land wasn't just simple, empty farmland, it already represented significant existing energy infrastructure, making any large-scale change in ownership here considerably more complicated than a typical rural land sale might normally be. Montezuma Hills shows just how messy and legally complicated this entire land-buying saga eventually became, moving well beyond simple purchase agreements into genuine allegations of collusion and price manipulation playing out in real courtrooms. This wasn't just quiet, camera-shy buyers anymore. This was an entire community allegedly working together to game the exact system that was trying to buy them out from underneath. Number 7. Collinsville, Solano County. Collinsville sits quietly within the Sacramento River Delta, a small, historic, unincorporated community that's watched the surrounding landscape shift dramatically as this land-buying story unfolded around it. Positioned right at the heart of the region targeted by this mysterious buyer, Collinsville represents one of the smaller, more easily overlooked communities that nonetheless found itself directly affected by decisions being made largely outside its own control. This part of the Delta carries real historical and ecological weight too, an estuary system that plays a genuinely important role in California's broader water supply network, adding yet another layer of significance to any large-scale land acquisition happening in this exact area. Residents here have described a strange, unsettling feeling watching this story unfold slowly around them. Farmland changing hands without much local input. Decisions about their community's future seemingly being made by people who'd never even bothered to introduce themselves properly to local leadership. That disconnect, a massive, well-funded operation acquiring land throughout an entire community without ever formally engaging with local government, became one of the most consistently criticized aspects of this entire saga as it played out publicly. For a small community like Collinsville, watching outside interests quietly reshape the land surrounding your home creates a genuine sense of powerlessness, regardless of whether that reshaping eventually turns out to be beneficial or harmful in the long run. Collinsville represents exactly the kind of small, historically rooted community, caught in the middle of decisions far bigger than anything local residents ever had a real chance to weigh in on directly. Number 6. Denverton, Solano County. Denverton exists as another small, unincorporated pocket of Solano County, surrounded by ranch land that became part of this same broader acquisition pattern sweeping through the region during this exact multi-year buying spree. Ranching families here had often worked this exact land for generations, passing down properties through their own families long before any mysterious buyer ever showed up offering unusually generous payouts for parcels most people assumed would simply stay in the same hands indefinitely. What makes small communities like Denverton particularly vulnerable to this kind of large-scale buying pattern is exactly their size. Without the kind of organized political infrastructure bigger cities have access to, small rural communities often struggle to mount any kind of coordinated response until a buying pattern has already progressed significantly further than anyone initially expected. Longtime residents here have described watching neighboring ranches sell quietly, one after another, each transaction seemingly disconnected from the last until the full scale of what was actually happening finally became impossible to ignore. This slow, incremental pattern of acquisition represents exactly the strategy that made this entire operation so difficult for local communities to respond to effectively in real time. No single dramatic moment, just steady, quiet accumulation until the buyer's presence had become simply too large to overlook any longer. Denverton shows how even the smallest, most easily overlooked rural communities can find themselves swept into something far bigger than local residents ever anticipated when they first noticed a neighboring ranch changing hands. For a community built around generational ranching, watching that exact way of life potentially reshaped by outside buyers represents a genuinely significant, deeply personal shift most residents never expected to witness within their own lifetimes. Number 5. Birds Landing, Solano County. Birds Landing might be one of the tiniest communities on this entire list, but it sits directly within the heart of the Montezuma Hills purchase zone, making it one of the specific rural hamlets most directly absorbed into this entire land buying story from its earliest stages. This kind of small agricultural community typically operates almost entirely outside broader public attention, exactly the kind of overlooked, easily ignored place where a large-scale buying operation could progress significantly before drawing any real outside scrutiny or media coverage. Longtime residents here have described the surreal experience of watching their quiet, rural way of life suddenly become the subject of national news coverage. Reporters and researchers suddenly curious about a community that had spent decades operating in near-total anonymity beforehand. What makes Birds Landing particularly interesting within this broader story is exactly that contrast: an incredibly small, quiet community becoming an unexpected focal point for a conversation about billionaire land acquisition, technology industry influence, and the future of rural California, all happening simultaneously around them. Some residents here have expressed genuine excitement about potential economic opportunity that new development might eventually bring, while others have voiced serious concern about losing the exact rural character that drew them to this specific community in the first place. This split reaction, hope and anxiety existing side by side within the same small community, reflects the genuinely complicated nature of this entire story. Not a simple villain versus victim narrative, but a genuinely difficult situation where reasonable people looking at the exact same facts have reached very different conclusions about whether this represents opportunity or genuine loss. Number 4. Fairfield, Solano County. Fairfield represents one of the larger, more established cities caught up in this broader story, sitting at the northern edge of the massive stretch of land purchased throughout Solano County over the past several years. Unlike some of the smaller, more rural communities on this list, Fairfield already has established city infrastructure and political representation, giving it considerably more capacity to respond formally to whatever changes eventually emerge from this ongoing land dispute. That said, Fairfield's proximity to the purchased land, along with its closeness to Travis Air Force Base, has made it a genuine focal point for concerns specifically about national security, given how much land the mysterious buyer had quietly acquired so close to active military infrastructure. Local congressional representatives have specifically raised alarm about exactly this issue, questioning why a company had spent hundreds of millions of dollars acquiring land in such close proximity to a functioning Air Force base, without any clear explanation offered to elected officials representing the area. This concern adds a genuinely serious dimension to the entire story, moving beyond simple questions of local development impact into territory involving actual national security implications that federal officials have taken seriously enough to formally investigate. Fairfield's residents and city leaders have had to navigate this complicated situation carefully, balancing genuine interest in potential economic development against real concerns about security, water resources, and the sheer scale of change this proposed project could eventually bring to their entire region. What makes Fairfield particularly significant within this broader story is exactly this combination: established city infrastructure meeting genuine national security concerns, creating a far more complex political situation than the story's earlier chapters set in smaller, quieter rural communities. Number 3. Suisun City, Solano County. Suisun City's story took a genuinely interesting turn after this entire project's original plan hit a wall, voters and residents pushing back hard enough that the original ballot measure ultimately failed after facing serious grassroots opposition. Rather than simply walking away, the company behind this massive land acquisition pivoted entirely, and Suisun City suddenly found itself at the center of a brand new strategy, exploring annexation to expand its own city limits as an alternative path forward that wouldn't necessarily require winning over skeptical countywide voters again. This pivot represents something genuinely significant about how this entire saga has continued evolving. When the original approach failed to win public support, the response wasn't retreat, it was strategic adaptation, finding an entirely different legal and political pathway toward accomplishing largely the same underlying goal. Suisun City's own council directed staff to begin formally exploring this annexation process, a move that's still very much ongoing and could realistically take years to fully play out one way or another. What makes this particularly interesting is exactly what it reveals about the broader strategy at play here. Rather than accepting a single Democratic vote as the final word, the project's backers have continued pursuing alternative routes specifically designed to eventually achieve their goals, regardless of how the original public vote actually turned out. Local advocacy groups formed specifically in response to this shift have described the annexation approach as a clear attempt to work around the need for genuine voter support throughout the broader county. Suisun City stands as a genuinely important example of exactly how this story didn't simply end when voters initially said no. It evolved into something more complicated, a persistent, well-funded effort finding new pathways forward, even after facing significant public pushback the first time around. Number 2. Rio Vista, Solano County. Rio Vista might be the single most directly affected community in this entire story. A small city of roughly 10,000 residents that would essentially find itself surrounded on nearly every side by this proposed new development, if the project eventually moves forward as originally planned. What makes Rio Vista's situation particularly striking is something the town's own mayor has stated publicly, that the company behind this massive land acquisition never once contacted city government directly, despite the project directly bordering Rio Vista and inevitably affecting nearly every aspect of daily life here, regardless of whether residents ultimately support or oppose it. Imagine an entire city discovering that a project this massive, one that would essentially envelop their entire community, had been planned and pursued for years without a single formal conversation with local elected leadership representing the people who'd actually be most affected by it. That specific detail captures something important about how this entire story unfolded. A genuinely massive, well-funded operation that prioritized secrecy and rapid land acquisition over basic community engagement, with the exact town sitting right at the center of everything. Rio Vista residents have expressed a complicated mix of emotions throughout this entire process. Some genuinely excited about potential economic opportunity and new jobs. Others deeply anxious about losing the quiet, small-town character that drew them to this specific community in the first place. Local leadership has had to navigate an incredibly difficult position, representing a community that stands to be transformed dramatically by decisions largely made outside their own control, while still trying to ensure residents' genuine concerns and interests get properly represented throughout whatever comes next. If a story this significant, involving a town literally being surrounded by a project it wasn't even consulted about, genuinely surprised you, go ahead and subscribe, because the final entry on this list ties this entire saga together in a way that honestly reshapes how you'll think about the whole story. Number 1. Travis Air Force Base Area, Solano County. And finally, we arrive at the piece of this story carrying the most serious, high-stakes implications of all: the land purchased in close proximity to Travis Air Force Base. An active military installation that's become the central focus of genuine national security concerns raised by federal officials. This isn't hyperbole either. The congressman representing this exact area has publicly stated concern that this entire land acquisition could represent a legitimate national security issue, specifically because of how close some purchased parcels sit to active military infrastructure. Federal officials have openly questioned where the hundreds of millions of dollars used to acquire this land actually came from, expressing genuine confusion and concern about a mysterious company purchasing land at prices reportedly several times higher than typical market value, all while operating in near-total secrecy for years before finally revealing its backers publicly. This particular thread transforms the entire story from a conversation purely about local development and small-town impact into something with genuinely serious implications for military security and oversight at the federal level. Officials have specifically emphasized just how unusual it is for any private company to acquire this much land this close to active military operations without ever proactively explaining their intentions to elected officials or military leadership beforehand. This concern alone helped keep this entire story firmly in national headlines for years, elevating what might have otherwise remained a fairly obscure regional land dispute into something drawing genuine federal attention and formal scrutiny. What makes this final piece so significant is exactly how it reframes everything else on this entire list: small towns, ranch land, wind farms, ecological preserves, all connected to a project that also happens to sit uncomfortably close to one of the most sensitive military installations in the entire region. If a story this layered and this consequential has genuinely changed how you think about quiet, rural land deals happening across California, go ahead and subscribe, because there's clearly much more of this exact story still unfolding right now, in real time, as we speak. So that's 10 small towns and communities across Solano County, all connected to one single, massive, billionaire-backed land acquisition that started in complete secrecy and has continued evolving in genuinely unexpected ways ever since it first came to light. From tiny, easily overlooked hamlets like Birds Landing and Denverton, all the way up to Rio Vista, a city that found itself essentially surrounded by a project it was never even consulted about, this entire story reveals something important about how quietly, and how quickly, enormous change can arrive in rural California when enough money and enough patience get applied to a single, sustained goal. This isn't a simple story with an obvious villain and an obvious victim either. Some residents genuinely see real opportunity in what's being proposed, while others feel real, justified anxiety about losing the exact rural character and community identity that drew them to these small towns in the first place. What ties every single piece of this story together is exactly that tension: private wealth and ambition colliding directly with small, established communities that never asked to become the center of a national conversation about land, power, and who actually gets a say in shaping their own community's future. If this video gave you a clearer, more complete picture of exactly what's been happening quietly in this corner of California, that was exactly the goal walking into this entire project from the very beginning. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already, because there's so much more of California's real, unfolding story still worth following closely together. Thank you so much for watching all the way through, and I'll catch you in the next video.